There we go. Now I got Zoom telling us recording in progress. So, well,
Yeah.
Drew, we've never spoken in person, but we've met on Twitter a little bit. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Washington State. I'm a Tacoma native, um, and lived there pretty much my whole life until I graduated high school, and then moved to Ellensburg, Washington, where I studied music education. Got my bachelor's in music ed from Central Washington University. Met my wife there, and while at Central was probably the most spiritually formative part of my life was being a part of a campus ministry from the Assemblies of God called Chi Alpha. And that's where I discovered Christian brotherhood and fellowship, and had some really important spiritual experiences during worship and at retreats and things like that. And then felt a big calling for the nations through some different conferences I attended and some mentors who poured into me and cast that vision, and eventually felt called to Indonesia. And after my wife and I got married, we taught as teachers for a year. And then the year after that, we did Chi Alpha in Indonesia. There was some campus ministry stuff happening there for a year. It was a program called Give a Year, Pray About a Lifetime that they were doing. And the whole idea that they were, calling, young Christian men and women to give a year and, pray and ask God if that's something that would be for a lifetime. And during that time, when we were being mentored by our pastor there, he was really encouraging us to consider how could we use our teaching certificates to continue to, say, live overseas, because we felt really confident that that is something that the Lord had led us to do. And so, yeah, that what happened was we cast our reels into the water, and eventually got teaching positions. So now we live here in North Africa in Tunisia.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm literally streaming to you live from Carthage of Hannibal fame. And so here we are. We're in our 5th year here in North Africa.
Wow, that's wild. That's great. Great. Now if I go to North Africa, I got someone to visit.
Yeah, I could take you to all the church ruins. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah, literally like a dog walk would be to go to the ancient baths where Augustine perhaps would have bathed. And, there's a church where they believe to be the site, it's, how lore develops, but it's believed to be the site of the Council of Carthage and, things like this. So yeah,
that's
it's pretty wild.
So cool.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Yeah.
That's so cool. Wow. Well, you're good at telling your story. You did that just, but you just got all right in there. Well, what did you want to talk about today? Because I know you wanted to talk, because again, you're on Twitter and I didn't know any of your background. So this is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's, it's always like you think about, well, what could we talk about? And then, when you're in the flow, it just becomes, whatever it becomes. So I don't really have a lot of preconceived notions about where this conversation is going to go, but
well, how did you find me? Why do you listen to my YouTube channel or my podcast? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe you just found me on Twitter, said, "Oh, this rando talks to randos."
I can flesh out this part of my story a little bit more then. So after arriving here in Tunisia, I also at the same exact time began doing my master's in ethnomusicology online. And ethnomusicology, basically it's like the anthropology of music and music in world cultures and societies. And this would be in 2017 when I began this program. And this is when I really first start learning about postmodernism and perspectivalism, and wrestling with questions of meaning on a more intellectual level, I suppose. I hadn't really had to be put through the ringer thinking through these issues. And so now I'm reading these, authors and scholars who are approaching at it from a secular anthropological frame about, how meaning is made in human cultures and how that's expressed through music. And I'm a music teacher. That's what I do here. I teach at an international school here. And Music has always been a way that I was able to connect with people across cultures, specifically through learning music. Like in Indonesia, I had lots of experiences working with Indonesian musicians, learning about gamelan, and how can I, as a jazz musician, sort of collaborate across that, and we developed lots of great bonds that way. Through ethnomusicology, it sort of gave me a lot of the analytical tools, I suppose, to read culture the first thing that did was it sort of dispelled a lot of my preconceived notions about what is music. And if just one example, like I study Arabic music as a primary focus of study, and in the Arabic music system, they have double the number of notes. And so in the Western system, between C and C is 12 notes. In the Arabic system, it's 24 because it's more subdivided in the intervals. And so anyways, the music has a different tonality. And so you start to then realize, oh, okay, well, some of the stuff is, say, social construct, as they would say. And then later that year, a colleague of mine just said it out loud. Someone I really listened to is Jordan Peterson. I'm like, who's Jordan Peterson? and this was this is during faculty lunch, and she's an interesting character. And so I checked him out, and like my jaw dropped, just like listening to him contradict a lot of the postmodern, say, orthodoxy that I was getting from my readings. Anyways, I was really surprised by that, and he just hooked me in. And so his war on postmodernism is sort of what got me into the Peterson bandwagon. And then I discovered the Bible stuff. And my connection to you, though, is actually through Esther O'Reilly. I don't know how I started following Esther on Twitter, but then she said, hey, you got to check out Paul VanderKlay. I'm like, who's Paul? And so I go on to Apple Podcasts. And so I become an audio listener. I actually wasn't a YouTube watcher for several years. So I've been following you my wife could testify, your voice is constantly like resonating in our concrete walls in our apartment.
Yeah, there's a lot of resonance in my voice. It's my wife and my mother. I grew up, my mother's always, turn it down. My wife, I'll be doing something outside. She says, I can hear you inside. Do you have to be so loud?
Yeah. So on, dog walks and doing the dishes and so that was, about 2.5 years ago when I started following you. And so, you've turned me on to Charles Taylor. And so I'm reading a lot of that and Meaning Crisis. And, where that's led me to now is having lots of interesting conversations with some of my coworkers who are Sam Harris followers and Eric Weinstein followers, and bringing a lot of those concepts that you brought to the table when you were discussing the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates and Eric Weinstein. And I was able to use a lot of the frameworks that you talk about on your channel, like Group A, Group B, scientific image, manifest image. And I appreciated that as a musician and as an ethnomusicologist, because like, if you look at music scientifically, that can only ever get you so far. And we humans universally participate in music on a level that's directly at the meaning level. And we can't define music adequately without recourse to the subjective, without recourse to narrative and mythos. And so combining what you were doing with my studies, I started investigating like music as a kind of apologetic almost. I don't know if that's the right word, but like I started noticing how like IDW and new atheists, like on YouTube, whenever you see like a clip of like Steven Pinker talking about music, it's like the one thing that they're satisfyingly mystified by. They're okay with it being a mystery. And there's like this weird like loophole in there, everything is, we can explain things this way, but then, oh, well, music, we don't really know what that is. And it's kind of a mystery. And they love it. Whenever you hear a quote from a new atheist, like Richard Dawkins is like hilarious whenever you listen to him talk about his love for Bach's music. And then
Christianity
Karen Armstrong.
and that didn't bother him.
Right. And then Karen Armstrong, in her book The Case for God, in the introductory chapter, she refers to music as like an example of, this is something that's like the most abstract art form, quote unquote, and yet all humans do it. It's the universal way every human culture has sort of approached God, through ritual. And so anyways, it's opened up lots of avenues of conversation for me with people. And I think the thing that like really sealed it home for me that this was a thing that people are starting to catch on to is when I heard a conversation between Glenn Scrivener and Justin Brierley. And Glenn is interviewing Justin about the state of apologetics today. And Justin says, for a long time, it was mostly about, Christians using science to counteract, the scientific arguments of atheists. And he says, it really, I'm more interested, this is what Justin Brierley said, he's more interested in meaning and how people find meaning. And the thing that he invokes is music. And and then he says music is sort of the unexplored apologetic in this. And so that's been a little bit of, when I'm not teaching, when I'm not doing grad studies, that's been sort of my passion project in terms of research and reading and things like that.
That's really cool. I last night actually, so of course, Tom Holland is a favorite fascination of mine, and they just released a The Rest is History episode on the Beatles. And I know that Tom Holland, one of his book projects coming up is he suspects that the 1960s, 70s, 60s are really 65 to 75 more than 60 to 69. The 1960s might be regarded at the level of like the 1520s in terms of dramatic, significant turns in religious cultural history. And he sees the Beatles as critical for that. And Dominic Sandbrook was skeptical. So last night, actually, my wife had a very long day because she's starting her school work and all my kids were out of the house. So I got to watch what I wanted to watch on TV. And so I turned up the YouTube and watched a very interesting BBC4 documentary on the origin of the Beatles. And, I was thinking a lot about these kinds of questions where you're exactly right. Music is this, we have no idea what's going on with us and music. I mean, scientifically, you can say, well, it's sound, it's vibrations in the air. Okay. But why, so I was watching, I didn't know much about the origin of the Beatles, frankly, because they never were by any means my favorite band. And I know I just spoke heresy for a whole bunch of people, but I always thought their music was a little simplistic. Some of their songs I like, but a lot of the early stuff. But then, looking at of course, for me with my history and, African-American stuff, the impact of African-Americans on, the history of music in England at that period. And of course, what was really nice about Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook. Sandbrook is a modern English historian, so he's talking about these post-war years, and so then why there did the Beatles just sort of, get this? And the Beatles, of course, were kind of playing around in Liverpool, and then we're over in Germany for a little while, and really it sounds like really learned a lot of stuff when they were in Germany, sort of in this red light district, and then went back to Liverpool, and suddenly people noticed, wow, they got skills they didn't have when they left. And then you switch out the drummer, and then sort of a professional comes in who sort of tunes them, and bang, they just explode. And it's like, it's kind of amazing what happened with Jordan Peterson, that explosion, but the Beatles was a lot bigger explosion. And why? And how does that fit into everything? Oh, it's such an interesting topic.
Peterson made the observation on one of his videos. I forget, he's talking to an author, and he just slips it in that how like music, like in the death of God and in the in the removal, or I suppose in the secularization of the West, that music in the 20th century, especially in that era, starts to fill in this void with the development of all these subcultures. And with the Beatles, people who are avid followers, like, okay, so I'll give you an example. I have a friend who has had identified as atheist for a while. And I don't know how he would self-identify today, maybe agnostic, if I could be generous towards him. He's a friend of mine. And we have these great conversations about faith, and and he is a big fan of Sam Harris, and so uses a lot of Sam Harrisisms in our conversations. And it's just sort of, you just have to be rational about God, and let's be real, but he's also like a participant in what he calls a doom metal band, and is this just avid super rocker. And I made this observation to him. I said, it's almost like you have these, music historians called it the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and you have your Sam Harris Apollonian, we got to be rational, reasonable about this. But then you have this like Dionysian side that just needs to come out. And where's that coming from? And what's the impetus there?
And can you justify it?
Right.
There's no need to justify that.
Right. Exactly.
That
right.
just is.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Music is like the role of the artist today, especially when COVID hit, we really started to see like, go to Spotify and pay money to support the artists, that are trying to get through this time. And when we see people,
they weren't starving before.
Right. And there's almost like this moral, like, push to support musicians and artists, because they're the ones that sort of carry us through culture. And it's like artists are like priests, to use a Pageauvian. I'm going to go sort of Pageauvian here. Artists are like priests who mediate meaning, cultural meaning, that's relevant to the zeitgeist. And musicians sort of most mysteriously of all, because it's the least iconic form, I suppose. And it's no surprise that all these subcultures have a soundtrack that go with them, and music is always connected to an identity group. It's connected to generations, ethnicity, class. There's just all sorts of ways that music has these connections. And I think when you ask the question, what is music? Like, I always sort of trolled my Facebook followers, because I'm a music teacher, but I'm always making these things like, I don't know what music is. I'm teaching music, but I don't actually know what it is. And especially like the Karen Armstrong point about how, like, music, like, what, rather than asking the question, what is music as a noun? I prefer to think of it as, what does music do the best? Ultimately, like, what are some things that need to have that? And for me, the conclusion was ritual. And it seems like everyone, regardless of who you are, regardless if you're a skeptical scholar, atheist, or Christian, the understanding of where the arts came from is through ancient rituals and, let's say, liturgies or cultic practices, shamanism, and drama comes from liturgies, comes from the ancient Greek religious rituals and things like this, and music comes from that too. And so you can live a life technically without music, but you can't express your God without some sort of participatory ritualized setting. And I think that's what music does the best. And I think that's sort of how it points us to the image of God. And this is something that I love talking about with other people who are musicians, like my friend who's an atheist and a Sam Harris follower, but also is in a doom metal band, and just trying to suss out, like, where does it come from? And, why are you doing it? And in today's age, like with what you've been talking about with the rise of the nuns, and like we're starting to see a lot more, I don't know if this is the right word, but sacramentalization or ritualizing of secular meaning through rituals, where where, in the secular space, things like mindfulness and meditation is like, oh, that's a normal and good thing to do. Things like yoga, and music has always been there doing things like that. So I find myself where I'm at in my secular workplace, seeing a little bit more of that sort of creep in, that our notion of what it means to be in a secular society, what it means to work in a secular, work environment, what that looks like is different than what it used to be. Perhaps you would classically define secularism as saying, okay, well, we recognize that everybody's religious. Let's just sort of agree to just not interface that way. And we'll just sort of occupy this neutral space. But now it's increasingly becoming more like secularism, not only is the default, but then there's also these forms that these rituals are good to do and okay to do, and we can force you to do them because, oh, it's secular, it shouldn't affect you. Those are not good. We need to keep those out.
I just finished a conversation that I'll probably share tomorrow. Guy was just sharing some of his journey through. He grew up United Methodist, was in an Episcopal church, and really enjoying the Episcopal church, and then the word came down from the hierarchy that they had to figure out how they were going to participate in the Pride Parade. And he said, we don't participate in the Veterans Day Parade. We don't participate in the 4th of July Parade. Why is the Pride Parade? But that's exactly what you're noting, that secularism has never been quite as vacuous as we imagined it should be. And it's very interesting what you say too, because one of my favorite lines from John McWhorter in a video where he's talking to Glenn Lowry is he's at Aspen. I think it's at Aspen, and there's this big, very elite, high level grouping, and racism is on the docket. Of course, McWhorter's written a number of books about racism, and everyone's talking about, we have to come to terms with racism. And so he just tells the people, what do you mean come to terms with racism? Tell me what that looks like. And then he says, I can imagine a soundtrack. And when he said that, I thought, oh, that's really telling. And that's exactly right. Because when he's pushing them and say, what exactly, he says, what we're going to do is we're going to walk out of here and we're going to take our bottle of water and say, oh yeah, that was really deeply meaningful. And we're all going to agree with that and go about our lives, and nothing's really going to change. So please tell me what coming to terms looks like. I can imagine a soundtrack. And I thought, that is so interesting, because he's exactly right. He's put his finger on it. And partly through now let's say the ritual of cinema, which, I remember talking to one of my friends here, and there was a couple different friends, and one of them said, this guy here, he's got weird taste in music. I said, well, what is your taste in music? He says, I like listening to movie soundtracks. And it kind of took me back a little bit, but a few years later, I was kind of watching some of the things that I was paying attention to with respect to music, and realized movie soundtracks are in some ways what hymnody was to Christendom, because movies have become such a deeply formative aspect, usually for the very young. Older people sort of, they might age out of movies to a degree, but and of course, part of the power of cinema is, and now especially with special effects and CGI, you have an incredibly broad canvas to paint upon, and you have all of these extremely powerful artistic elements. When is the last time we watched a movie that had no soundtrack? And if you're just watching a movie and you're paying attention, let's pay attention to the soundtrack. And I was just talking about the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. One of the things that got my attention right away with that was the soundtrack. It's enormously dependent on the soundtrack. Whereas I don't even have an opening like Peugeot has, or like Peterson has for my videos. And part of that is like, I just can't be bothered. But another part of that is, I actually did choose a piece of music, and I actually contacted the musician who wrote and I got permission to use it. But I've never pulled the trigger on it, partly because as a pastor, another one of the things that I know is we have all of these churches, at least post-reference, have spent a lot of time on theological confessionalism. But any watcher of churches in the United States knows probably nothing is more determinative of your audience in a church than the music.
100%.
And even really, I remember hearing Rick Warren, who's one of the most successful mega church, said, well, the church was kind of doing okay. And then we got our music guy, and then things took off. And it's like, so Rick, what's that say about your preaching, huh?
Yeah. This is good. There's a lot of ways we could take this. When I was in university, I mentioned Chi Alpha and going to some retreats. At one retreat, there was a Saturday evening service, and the worship band was there, and they'd started playing the music. And then there was at that time in my life, I was struggling with some things that young men would struggle with, and praying through it. And there was a moment where the leader of the worship band invited people. It's like an altar call, basically. Come forward if you want prayer. And a lot of times when that happens at church, I'm like, is that for me? I don't know. And I just sort of still I stand, but I'm in my seat. But this time was very different. It was an automatic response that my legs just sort of carried me to the front. And I actually, like, cognitively was like, I don't actually know why I'm coming to the front, but there I was. And then I knelt down and I started praying, and someone else had put his hand on my back and asked me, and from a different part of the state, and asked how he could pray for me. And I was just confessing some things, and then he started praying for me, and then I started praying, and the worship team is playing, and it is loud, in those situations, volume wise, it is loud, and that's an effective thing that they do. And so then I started praying out loud, and then I felt something happen in this moment that it's the only time I've ever felt anything remotely close to this. Was basically like I started just watching myself worship, and I'm literally screaming at the top of my lungs, but I can't actually hear myself screaming at the top of my lungs. And I feel like I'm just watching myself do things, and it's like the closest thing to like literally being drunk. And that's just how not in control of the members. They're just crying out to the Lord. And I was in that state for maybe a minute and a half or something. And then just came out and just felt this, I felt really at peace after that had happened. And, and since then I'd always been like, well, what did that moment mean? And there's all sorts of layers of analysis that could come on that kind of a situation. On a social constructionist might look at that and say, well, you had the music going, you're in this social context, there's these people there, and you're agreeing together in this powerful thing. I have a Pentecostal background, so I would say something like that was the Spirit of God working in me. And I'd always sort of wondered what was the role of music in that situation. If I didn't have the music, would that have happened? And does that even matter? All I know, just coming from that is like, that was, that was a moment. I know people who, they've been to South America, they went to a cave, and then they took a hallucinogenic and had this like amazing spiritual experience. Or they go to Burning Man and they take something and they have this amazing, I didn't take anything. I was just worshiping, and I had that experience. Yeah. And it
happens all the time. Yeah. This is all over the place. And people are like, well, I think you really need to. And it's like, I don't know why you think this is so remarkable. We've got buildings and institutions committed to this all over the place, and it's happening all the time. So no, you're exactly right.
Yeah. And you, while back, you were talking about Bethel,
Yeah.
Bethel worship specifically, and
Yeah.
you'd made this reference about how, like, well, if the guitar player just does this one thing, if I hold the note just right, there is an aesthetic that's the sound, right? And if you don't do that sound, it's not the whole, that's not music of the spirit. Like there's just association. We pair these sounds with these experiences. And well, that opens up a really interesting conversation about, what is the role of music in church? And when you can start comparing confessions, and then you go to, like, you have Gregorian chant and Orthodox chant, and those are, I don't want to dovetail too far off, but, like, one of the things that I am sort of dealing with in my own faith life is, it's like I have an evangelical / Pentecostal background. I don't even know where I would sort of pin the tail on the donkey, but somewhere in that mix, but not very liturgical in the sense of a traditional liturgy.
Right.
Nothing high church.
Of course, Assemblies of God has a liturgy. They just don't
right,
call
right.
it that.
Yeah, they just don't call it that. Right, exactly. And in the last few years, since I've been on this Jordan Peterson, Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Pajot journey, sort of like recognizing that I do have a longing for some grounding in, I don't know if it's neo-sacramentalism is the right word, or if there's just some sort of, just, I need a thing. I need to do a thing. And well, here's an object lesson. So we went back to the States over the summer, and my wife and I like to go to antique shops and things like that. And I found this is like a Lutheran prayer book. And I was like, okay, well, I'll check it out. And I started flipping through that. And, late in the last couple of months, it's been a regular part of my prayer life. There's daily prayers, there's evening prayers for 4 weeks. I have a picture of the Christ Pantocrator from the Hagia Sophia mosaic. I don't know if it's the actual Christ Pantocrator, but anyways, I have that, like, up here in my office right here. It's like an icon, but I'm like, here I am, a Pentecostal, or an evangelical, but I have this, like, I don't like pray to it, but when I pray, I'm like facing in that direction. And anyways, I find myself going through these, like, shifts in how I walk out my faith and how I practice it. And so coming back to music, like when you look at what's happening with Gregorian chant and an Orthodox chant, what you have is a tradition that is a Christian tradition, in the sense of, when you hear that sound used in a secular context, they're borrowing it from the church, historically speaking. Whereas there's a little bit of an inversion in this world, in the Bethel world, say, where there's an aesthetic that's sort of being plucked from in the secular musical world, that's then sort of being reappropriated into this context here. And anyways, that's sort of this inverted image that I have right now of just sort of what music means in the church.
Yeah. I wish you'd been with me yesterday. I was at a memorial service for African-American woman, and it was in a Black church. And I've officiated and participated in many Black funerals, and they have their own liturgy. They really do. And I kept the program. The program is quite lovely, and they had her obituary, and she's the mother of someone who's been who I've been pastoring, I'll say it that way. And it was, I was very happy that I could go to the service. The service was about 2 hours and 15 minutes long, which is not the way white folks do memorial services generally. And the message in that service was about 45-50 minutes. And that pastor doesn't do eulogies like I do eulogies, but it was classic Black apostolic. You had the organist, you had the preacher, they were in sync. He was working so hard to try and get someone to come forward to be baptized that I was ready to be baptized just so we'd land the plane. It's like if you're just really working hard on this dry tree here, buddy. But anyway, but I thought a lot about the way the music, the ritual, the rhythm, the words, because I've seen a fair amount of it, and it just is. So I'm sitting there, and why not pay attention to what's going on and try and think about it? But you're exactly right, and your use of ritual here. I mean, even that word is, what do we mean by that? And
Yeah.
it's sort of in some ways, if music is vibration of air, ritual is in some ways the vibration of motion, because it involves repetition, but it's also repetition and variation. And
well, and as soon as we start talking about any of the arts this way, you start to see how in the West, our conception of what is art, what is the arts, what, like our fundamental association with music is as an art. What is an art? And, I'm a music teacher, and like music is part of the arts program. And, you go to an art museum and you see these paintings on the wall where we fundamentally think of music as like, okay, well, it's this thing that's our word association is art. And I think in the Western sense, what we've done with art is, I think to use Charles Taylor's concept of the buffered self versus the porous self, where that word art can just be slapped on to just about anything, and then it becomes a buffered thing where, and I see the biggest like contradiction of terms when they say something like Islamic art, where it's like, okay, here's a book of Islamic art, and what are you looking at? You're looking at the Quran, you're looking at mosques, you're looking and you're reading about the recitation of the Quran as their music. It's like, they don't say it's art, we say it's art, because from our lens, we're adding this buffered thing. Whereas from the porous self, right, from within, it's like, no, a Muslim is not going to say that the recitation of the Quran is music. And that's a whole subject that comes up in Islam of, and we're seeing it right now with the Taliban in Afghanistan. I just saw an article about a folk musician who was executed, and worried about the ban on music, and that just opens up, well, what is music, and how do they define music, and why do we have the right to define music as one thing, versus those? They have it's a very different definition of what is music. Yeah. Even though the Taliban have, like, say, military chants or songs or something like that, there are some certain kinds of form like that. So
yeah. And somebody made the observation recently that the protests in the wake of the George Floyd incident have, unlike many protests in American history, of which obviously these protests they're certainly participating in the ritual of American public protest, there's been no song in this movement, which is, its absence is fascinating, because there's song for Vietnam protests, there's song for the anti-Jim Crow civil rights protest. There's, many protest movements in America have had song associated with them, and those songs, in the church I grew up in, those songs sometimes were in and out of the church. Sometimes church songs are appropriated for protest songs. With these protests, there are chants, no peace, no justice, no peace, things like that. But there's no song. And I remember one of my professors in college talking about Cromwell and some of the English civil wars, and he was saying, these are armies that sang hymns, and he says, if you're facing an army that's singing a hymn, don't think that's an incidental or small thing. And he's exactly right, because that song, turns that army into a unity, and gives them a sense of, and you read this in the Bible, oh, there's a God among them, and so then all their enemies flee. Well, if you're singing a hymn together, well, there's a God among them, and don't think that's incidental necessarily to the outcome of the battle. So I mean, this stuff goes down a long ways.
Yeah. And when we talk about music as like, so someone would look at the Bible and say, well, what does the Bible say about music? And we have like the NIV that uses the word music, like bring me a musician, and they led the music. Like the word music literally is not in the Hebrew Bible in terms of our translation of music. They use all these different verbs, and the verbs that are connected to musical processes are directly, it's like maybe it's singing, or it's like pulling, as in pulling on a string. And when we start to try to have like a music centered conversation with like the word music, we have that's sort of, I think there's kind of an anachronism that we're applying on all of these things, when music per se, outside of its context of what it's being used for, we don't want to disembody things. Like we live in this headphones culture when I can listen to the London Symphony, just on my headphones, like just without being at the concert hall or seeing the musicians or things like that. I think just appreciating that all forms of music are equally musical, whether it's a folk song or a chant, or a symphony, that these are all things that sort of, I think, just come from this human impulse to ritualize things. And I am using that word a lot. I wanted to talk about something really quick. So in your response,
before you go that,
yeah.
I mean, the question about the Bible is very interesting, because it also touches on technology, because of course the Psalms, what are those Psalms?
Yeah.
But they didn't have technology to, they didn't have notes. I mean, people don't recognize that, sheet music is technology. And now, of course, recorded music is technology. So, I mean, there's lots of layers. Anyway, I just wanted to get that in before we
get
to your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. That's good. So you were doing a response video to Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. You were juxtaposing in your latest one, Driscoll with, what was her name?
Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Yes. Anyways, I think it was on that video, I left a comment about Donald Miller, where, so this is interesting, and I wanted to sort of talk this through with you. So Blue Like Jazz, as I'm a millennial, and it was very important to me and to that generation of readership in terms of like sort of the emerging postmodern zeitgeist of finding meaning and being able to articulate what is the spiritual life. And it actually was not a shade thing to say I'm spiritual but not religious. I even myself had said that when I was like 18. I'm a Christian, but I would prefer to identify as spiritual, not religious, because religion
Christianity
is
a relationship, not a religion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Anyways, and I remember like it was one of the nights of the DNC where Donald Miller he leads a benediction prayer, and why was he invited to pray for that? Well, he's connected to this thing, and somewhere along the line he capitalizes on this concept of story, and so he writes Blue Like Jazz, and then Blue Like Jazz becomes a movie, and then he writes a book about that process of Blue Like Jazz becoming a movie, and then he starts applying the concept of inventing this fictitious Donald Miller. What kinds of obstacles is he going to face in the movie, and how can we portray that? He applies that same sort of story framework to his life, like, and he says in the book, he's like, basically, a story is a character who wants something, who overcomes difficulty to get it. And he sort of just boils it down to that little formula. And then he starts applying it to his life, and he goes to Machu Picchu and participates in these road bike races and things like that, and then starts applying, and I would call it a heuristic. He's using story as like a heuristic in that sense to motivate him to do things. And then that turns into storyline, which is, it becomes like a self-help tool for people who they can turn their life into a story, and it becomes this organizational tool for your life. And then that turns into story brand, where now he's applying this to businesses and corporations, and storyline is all done away with. And now, like, I look in my email inbox and I type in Donald Miller, and it's just like hundreds of emails of like ways to get your subscribers to read your newsletter, how to, raise revenue with the best ads. And it's like, everything is all of these just like, these like sales pitches. And then you go onto his Twitter page or his Facebook page, and he's got the tie and the code, and like his logo is not hipster at all. It's like really old schoolish, boomerish, and anyways, he just went full on capitalist.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was an interesting development, I suppose, of this person who was like held up as like this postmodern icon, the spiritual Christianity, meaning guy.
And you sent me that stuff, and so I did a little bit more digging, because I actually, a few years ago, I had to do a book culling in my office, and so I have a couple of boxes of books, and I think Blue Like Jazz didn't make the cut, so I have to go dig it out. But when you mentioned that, I was like, oh wow. I had forgotten what a big deal Donald Miller was, 15 years ago or so. I mean, everybody was reading that book in circles that I knew, and, women's Bible studies, but usually of millennials. And I'd remember just in the back of my head, oh yeah, he kind of turned this thing into a brand. So then I went and looked at his Twitter, and it was like, wow, he went hard. But that's so interesting, because one of the interesting things about Mark Driscoll is that he and Nadia Bolz-Weber both begin as sort of anti-elite, populist, grungy rebels. And then, of course, along the way, you just watch Mark Driscoll become just completely seeker. He completely succumbs to the institution, and now Nadia Bolz-Weber becomes the face of the ELCA, and it's like, so much for the revolution.
Right.
But this is what we're seeing in American culture, just this continual it's a round and round, it's a revolution. That's what a revolution is, but it's just this continual recycling.
Never even thought of that.
Yeah. Well, that's these are the revolutions. You want the wheels on your car to, like the wheels on the bus, to go round and round. That's what's happening with these revolutions. And to look at, and I you sent me that. I hadn't looked at the DNC prayer thing because I wasn't at a place I could listen to it when I opened Twitter. But when I looked at him, it's, and this to me is where you sort of get into the Sermon on the Mount, because when Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. You can't serve God and mammon. He doesn't say God and Satan. It's not a dualism. It's not a good and evil dualism. And I'm not saying that there isn't good and evil dualistic strains in Christianity or themes, or that good and evil isn't an important thing to look at, but it's very interesting. I mean, if of all the things that Jesus said, no one can serve two masters, and then say, okay, what is the other master? Because one's clearly God, and then the other is mammon. It's like, wow. And I wrestle with that. I wrestle with that a lot, because I mean, part of it is that when I look at people who have let's say the fancy word now is deconstructed. When I look at people who have walked away from their faith, the faith they usually walk to is money. And it becomes about the money. And that's a
good point. Yeah.
It's really hard to resist. It's because, I mean, money is godlike because it is so fungible. Yet we all also notice that, thinking about Castaway, the Tom Hanks movie, at some point, probably burn paper money just because, you know, you got any more of that money we can burn? Maybe I'll wipe myself with it. You know, but I mean, money is sort of, you know, money is in some ways sort of fungible status that can be, it's metered status that we can sort of count, not perfectly, but so to see,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying Nadia Bolz-Weber is a sellout. It's just fascinating watching the evolution. And so then I was looking at, so then I went and looked at Mars Hill Grand Rapids, because I found it phenomenal that, you know, both, you know, Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell, they both named their churches Mars Hill. You know, one's in Seattle, one's in Granville, Michigan, which is an area that I know quite well. And so then Rob Bell is long gone from that church, and now it's Mars Hill Bible Church. And I just thought, oh, culture is like gravity in some places, you know, it'll bring you there.
Yeah, I mean, and all of these people that we're talking about, these Gen Xers, in that time period, these were all people that, like, you know, in college that I'd talked to with other, you know, young Christians. They would, you know, talk about Rob Bell, you know, and they would watch like Numa videos, I think was what he did. And, you know, we'd watch them in small group, you know, and then I also had my friend who was super in on the Mark Driscoll train and was constantly sharing sermons and things like that. And John Eldridge, another one, you know, Wild at Heart, everybody read that book. If you wanted to be a man, that was the book to read. Right.
That's right.
And look, I read it like a couple of times. I was like, this is, and it's very Jordan Peterson-esque in the sense of, like, you know, what are men doing with their lives today, you know? And
it's and it, you know, the other interesting thing to note, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, Paul Vanderklay. You know what? You know where we're all at demographically? We're just at the end of the boomers and just at the cusp of the Xers. We're not really boomers, because you'd find the memes on Facebook that are like people born, you know, in the 60s. How am I a boomer? You know, because all of these boomer rituals that people born from, let's say, you know, 45 to 60, people 60 to 70 in that range, born in those years, that was done. And the Xer hadn't really started yet. And there's so many layers to this world. And then music too, because I was old enough to be, you know, I was old enough to know a lot of the 60s, early 70s music. But I came of age much more in the rise of disco and the death to disco fight. And, you know, and of course, growing up in all the different stuff goes on forever.
There's a new documentary that's coming out like next month or November. It's called The Jesus Music, which is, and there's a bunch of interviews of contemporary Christian musicians, you know, in this, Lauren Daigle and all sorts of other, you know, famous ones. But it's connecting the origins of contemporary Christian music to the Jesus movement, and music from that time. So I'm looking forward to watching that when that comes out. But there is some like afterburn or afterglow, you know, musically speaking, where, you know, your pastor might be the oldest school Bible thumper, but if your musicians up there are evoking the sounds of that movement, then, you know, that's it, man. Like you're still participating in that, and it's still living on. It's still moving forward. You know, that era of artistic, you know, outpouring, you know, Woodstock in the church, it's still going on in some sense.
Absolutely. It would always, you know, because it was well into the 2000s when I would catch, you know, newspaper articles that were saying things like, there's a new thing happening in the churches. They're playing guitars and drums instead of the organ. And I'm like, I can tell you haven't been to church in a long time. It is not new.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so fascinating to me because, even so, Rob Bell pastored this Granville Avenue church in Grand Rapids, but that grew out of a Calvary Chapel. I think I've got it correctly. A Calvary Chapel church that was in Grand. I mean, there's these connections go back through in fascinating ways. And I haven't thought about the emergent movement in a long time. I name it every now and then, but I hadn't paused and thought about Donald Miller or and then once the name was there, it was like, oh yeah, that was
That was the whole thing.
and it's hard to describe, but I can imagine a soundtrack.
Yeah. Even jazz. I'm a jazz musician myself, but just the invocation of jazz in that, in that illustration.
Well, and when you look at, what did Bill Hybels do? It was fascinating because I came back to North America. I came to this church. And when I came to this church, our classis had this whole classis-wide junket out to Willow Creek. And I had no idea who Bill Hybels or Willow Creek was. I was living in the Dominican Republic. What do I know? And all my attention to, African-American stuff. And there's just not the thing that I was on. I go to Willow Creek and it's like, okay, we're playing jazz. We're sort of in a big auditorium that could be in a junior college. But the message is basic American revivalist evangelicalism from a guy who grew up in the CRC. And, I'm just watching this. And so, we've taken, 4 spiritual laws and the Roman road, and we've taken all of those things and we put jazz on top of it.
Yeah.
And we took the crosses down. Then, of course, the emergents are like, they're going to put crosses up. They're going to put lots of crosses up. And we're not just going to put crosses up. We're going to have candles and we're going to have intentional ritual. And because, of course, the Seekers stripped out all the ritual, but music, nobody, well, then of course, then there's the intentional absence of music. And I mean, it goes on forever and ever.
Well, my last question, is it Vanderclay or is it Vander Clay?
That's a good question. Or is it Van der Clay?
Yeah.
So technically there is a space, but that space, when computers became de jour in America, I can't tell you how many issues that space created, because now computers are getting sophisticated enough that a name can have a space in it. But I mean, just recently in my most recent driver's license from the state of California, I now have Vander Clay as my last name. For a long time, it was Clay. And so I get all sorts. I always knew it was junk mail, somehow culled from the state of California when, dear Mr. Clay. It's like, okay, I know where you got that name from. So it is. So often I just scrunch it together because it just makes it easier, which just tends to confuse everything. So whenever my wife or my kids have to sign up something, they're trying to think of what it is that we signed up for, and space or no space. So I know Hollanders that have they scrunched it together and they kept it scrunched together and said enough. But others are out there because many Dutch names are Van der Clay. So I don't know what to do with it. So at times we've had family discussions. Now we should all agree, space or no space. And but then it's already on like social security cards, driver's licenses, documents, to actually do a formal legal name change to abolish the space. I don't have time for that. I'll go to my grave with the ambiguity.
That's good. That's good, man. Well, listen, I just, I'm just glad I was able to talk to you in person, because I have always wanted to tell you that, I really appreciate the work that you do. Your work, you say this about John Vervaeke all the time. Your work has always helped me so much. Well, your work has helped me so much. And, for all the people in the Discord server, and it's brought a lot of, you come up directly or indirectly in my personal estuary, wherever that is, out in the world. And so anyways, just thank you and God bless you for everything you do.
Well, thank you. Well, this was fun. Can I share this talk? Because it sure was fun.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, that's good. Well, thank you, Drew. And
Yeah.
and now I'll at least have a story and a face and a lot more substance to think of you when we go back and forth on Twitter or wherever we meet. And maybe if I get over to Tunisia sometime, that would be fun too.
Oh man, I almost ran into you in Yellowstone. Actually, my wife and I did this whole road trip of the national parks over the summer, and we were there like 2 days before you were there, sending your photos on Twitter. I was like, I was there, just a couple days before.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oh man, it freaks my family out when we sort of bump into someone who knows me online. They're like, I don't know if this is a good idea. Anyway, Drew, it's a delight to talk to you.
Yes, you too.
Take care.
Bye.